So let's think about the possibility of cognitive miracles. Here's my loose reconstruction of an argument from Green. We've already considered the first premise of the argument. I now want to consider the second premise. What does it mean, and is there a reasonable case to be made for the second premise? Well, Green notes that genetic transmission, cultural transmission, and learning from personal experience are the only mechanisms known to endow fast processes with the information they need to function well. Seems reasonable? Of course, anybody could come along and say, look, I've got some novel mechanism whereby your fast process will get going. But this seems like a reasonable bet, as far as anybody knows today. And Green goes on and he defines unfamiliar problems in relation to this. He says, unfamiliar problems are those with which we have inadequate evolutionary, cultural, or personal experience. Okay, so far so good. So we're going to take the notion of an unfamiliar problem to be a technical term. That's why that star is there, because we're treating that as a technical term. Now Green goes on and he says, it would be a cognitive miracle if we had reliably good moral instincts about unfamiliar moral problems. Okay, good. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? Because we've defined unfamiliar to be exactly the kind of problem where we lack the evolutionary, cultural, or personal experience which is necessary for the fast processes to tell us what's right. So here he's assuming, of course, that moral instincts are dependent on those fast processes. That's something that we're going to come to later, so you don't have to agree with that now. I could have changed this quote to refer to fast processes directly, but I like to stick to Green's words. So I think this so far sounds right. And he goes on and says, we should accept the no cognitive miracles principle. When we're dealing with unfamiliar moral problems, we ought to rely less on those fast responses and more on the slower ones, lest we bank on cognitive miracles. Now you see here, we've already talked about this. Green says automatic emotional, and I'm just saying fast because I don't think we need the commitment to emotional here at all. Likewise, I don't think we need the commitment to consciousness or to control when we're talking about fast processes. That was the idea of the stripped down dual process view. But we can factor that into the no cognitive miracles principle, no problem. So on the face of it, it looks like we've got a principle that's so straightforward, it could hardly be wrong. What could be the problem here? Well, consider this. You see two people and they are sitting down playing a game of chess together. And you think to yourself, gosh, you know, that's amazing. How are they doing that? Bam, bam, bam. They're playing speed chess perhaps, so they're moving the pieces very rapidly. And what you notice afterwards, perhaps you're not as good at chess as they are, right? But what you realise afterwards is they've just played the most elegant and beautiful game you can imagine. How did they do it? Well, according to many theorists, chess players rely very heavily on those fast processes in order to identify moves. And it seems like they must be doing that when they're playing these particularly fast games of chess, when they're playing speed chess. Right, okay, so here's the deal. Fast processes are not supposed to be reliable in unfamiliar situations, but fast processes are also supposed to explain success in speed chess, even successes at extremely high levels, right, where the processes are extremely reliable. That tells us that somehow how to win a chess match has to be a familiar problem after all. But that's confusing because if you think about it, we characterised an unfamiliar problem as one with which we have inadequate evolutionary, cultural or personal experience. But wait a minute. Here's the tricky thing. It's inadequate, isn't it? So inadequate or adequate relative to what? Well, here's the trick. Of course, it has to be inadequate for that fast process to do its thing. What's characteristic of people who are brilliant at speed chess is that they have absolutely tons of personal experience. Is that experience adequate for the fast process to do its work? Well, it must be, right? Because we see them winning the chess game. But now you can kind of see that it looks like we might be moving in a bit of a circle here, right? So it looks like the no cognitive miracles principle is true, but it might be quite difficult to get useful applications of it because we've characterised it in terms of a notion of adequacy, and that notion of adequacy is relative to what the process in question needs. Now, I think things get worse if we switch from chess to thinking about fast processes in physical cognition. So you know that I'm a fan of the idea that we can draw an analogy between ethical cognition and physical cognition. In both cases, I think that the dual process model has quite a lot to be said for it. Now, in the case of the physical, we know that some of the fast processes are characterised by the principles of impetus mechanics. But here's the thing, the operation of those fast processes is characterised by principles. What that means, of course, is that the fast processes will be reliable in a range of cases which you may not have very much personal experience with at all, right? They only have to be related because the same principles apply in the new case. So roughly speaking, as long as air resistance and friction aren't particularly important and gravity is held constant, your fast processes are going to be great, roughly speaking. So those fast processes, in the physical case, are going to yield correct predictions in what look to be, on the face of it, some unfamiliar cases. If I show you, for example, a point light display, so this is a situation where all you can see is the sources of light attached to the joints of a person, they're moving around. I should give a lecture actually using a point light display, that would be cool. I could set one up here now, I've just realised that. So the point light display, very familiar, I should show you one actually. You just attach lights and all you can see then are the tiny lights attached to the person's joints. And what's striking is that you can often make very good sense of what's happening in a point light display. You can see people who are, giving, receiving, kicking, walking, and so on. Readily identify those things, even though it seems on the face of it like these ought to be unfamiliar cases. Likewise, if you think about cartoons, so you're watching a cartoon involving some kind of rodent or whatever it might be, a duck, especially one of these old ones, you think, gosh, I mean, it's not something that you might have had lots of personal, cultural or evolutionary experience with, certainly evolutionary experience, and cultural is kind of recent, I guess, and it might be the first time you're watching it, but the very first time you're watching it, you've never seen one of these things before, the very first time you watch a cartoon, makes perfect sense to you. How's that working out? Well, that's because we have these principles. So the tricky thing here is that you might on the face of it think that the way that a cartoon is constructed, so very crude shapes in 2 dimensions moving around, often at a fairly slow rate, so only 25 times a second, right? So nothing in your natural environment stays basically stationary most of the time and only moves 25 times a second. You might think that was unfamiliar, but it turns out not to be unfamiliar in the relative sense, because the experience that you have is not inadequate, as it happens, given the nature of the fast processes, for processing it. Gosh, that's tricky, isn't it? So here's my thought. When we go to the no cognitive miracles principle, we ought to rely less on automatic responses and more on the slower responses in unfamiliar situations. I'm not suggesting that's false, but I am suggesting it looks on the face of it as if there's a problem with applying it. The problem seems to be that we've defined unfamiliar situation in terms of what's adequate to the fast process. So unless we know quite a bit about how the fast process actually works, it's going to be quite difficult to work out which situations are unfamiliar. So it might be that we're not in a good position to apply this in the ethical case. Let me put the objection like this. By definition, unfamiliarity depends on inadequacy. A situation is only unfamiliar if it's inadequate, if your experience of that kind of situation is inadequate to the needs of your fast processes. But we don't know which evolutionary, cultural or personal experiences are adequate in the case of moral cognition because we don't know how those faster processes work. So that tells us that we don't know which problems are unfamiliar in the ethical case. And it seems to follow from that we could make no practical use whatsoever of the no cognitive miracles principle. It's not to say it's false, it would be to say, look, we're never going to get anywhere with it. And if that's the case, we ought to stop right away, right? Save ourselves from going through the next parts of the loose reconstruction of the argument we're considering. But I want to reply to this objection by saying that the conclusion is false. So I'm going to give an objection to the objection, and my objection is that this is false. It doesn't actually follow from 3, although it seems it might do. Why do I think that? Well, the issue about reliance on fast processes has been quite extensively studied, because this turns out to be a practical problem in many domains, including business, many parts of the business world, but also medicine and statistics and law, among other domains. So this sort of issue has been widely studied. Now, Hogarth makes a very interesting point. He makes a point that we should be careful not to assume that the learning environment, so the environment in which the fast processes are developed, whether that's evolutionary, matter of sort of cultural history or personal experience, in any case, we shouldn't assume that those environments in which the processes are acquired are going to overlap completely with the processes in which they're exercised. Indeed, what tends to happen is that the two things do not overlap entirely and may diverge quite significantly. So Hogarth has made sort of half of a career really out of trying to model what happens when those two things come apart, and what we might do to ensure that we avoid situations where they come apart. And what's come out of this is some rather elegant guidance. I think this is deceptively simple but interestingly deep. He says, when a person's past experience is both representative of the situation relevant to the decision and supported by much valid feedback, trust the intuition, trust the judgment that the person makes on the basis of those fast processes. When it's not, be careful. So how do we apply this? Well, we first of all got to think about, in the moral case, what kind of history might have been relevant to the situation. If we think that the fast processes are a consequence of things acquired over your life course as well as things acquired over evolution, what we should notice is that there are many things that you tend not to have much experience of until relatively late in life, like weapons of mass destruction, although they do feature in ethical arguments. There are also things like, being able to effectively manipulate people at large distances, over large distances, which you wouldn't have encountered a lot over the course of evolution. When my kids first discovered that they could control things using a remote control, they turned the thing at me, right? And they thought that perhaps they could do something to me with the remote control. Very intuitive idea. Natural extension. All right, so one thing that we would need to be sure about in order to rely on fast processes in the ethical case is that those processes were a consequence of experiences. They've been shaped, evolution, historical or personal experience, by experiences that are largely overlapping with current times. Right. The other thing we'd need is that there would have to be valid feedback. So if you think back to the case of chess or the physical case, you can see that you very quickly get valid feedback because you lose or win a game of chess. In the ethical case, we would need something similar as well in order to be confident. So here's my thought. It's a very simple thought. If we follow Hogarth and colleagues, we can take situations in which we don't know exactly how the fast principles operate, and we don't know exactly what kind of experience and so on that the person has had. But we can use this criterion nevertheless to decide whether or not to trust those fast processes. So I think that it follows that this conclusion is a mistake. It's not true that we can make no practical use of the no cognitive miracles principle. Now, you might be sceptical about Hogarth and colleagues' particular approach, but I note that, non-coincidentally actually, a framework offered by Kahneman and Klein, a sort of combination of their two separate pieces of research, so quite interesting because they were largely independent until they came together and wrote this particular piece in 2009, have come to broadly the same conclusion that Hogarth did. So they developed something called the recognition model, according to which you have to have two conditions in order to rely on a judgment which is a consequence of a fast process. Firstly, the environment has to provide valid cues to the nature of the situation. Sounds familiar? Secondly, you have to have had an opportunity to learn the relevant cues, right? So very similar to the valid feedback idea from Hogarth. So what am I saying here? I'm just saying that you can approach this via one or another of the researchers who've studied expert thinking across sort of chess players, business decisions, statisticians, perhaps sometimes medical practitioners, and you come to essentially the same conclusion in both cases. We can make practical use of the no cognitive miracles principle. So here's the thing. It's true that faster processes are unreliable in unfamiliar situations, but we do not know which situations are unfamiliar, at least in the ethical domain, because we don't know how those faster processes operate, or we don't know enough about that to make confident decisions. This is a familiar situation, this is an unfamiliar situation. By contrast, in the physical case, we can make such points because we know quite a bit about how the fast processes operate in the case of physical cognition. We can say that when you're messing with gravity, or when air resistance becomes a key factor, you're in an unfamiliar situation. We can say that. There's nothing comparably clear that we can say about the ethical case. I've been saying that makes it tempting to suppose that we can't make use of this point about unfamiliar situations. But I think we can. I think we can still make use of the no cognitive miracles principle, because the no cognitive miracles principle can be used even if we don't know which particular situations are unfamiliar. We just have to be confident that the person whose fast processes we're relying on has experienced a relevant range of cases that are representative of the new scenario. So there isn't an interestingly different new factor there, and that that person has had good feedback in the past, has made a series of decisions which have been shown to be right or wrong in the past. When those two conditions are met, we can rely on the faster processes. When they're not met, then we should be cautious. So I want to say here, I think that we've established that this premise is true. It's true that faster processes are unreliable in unfamiliar situations. And we've also defused an objection that the premise might be useless as well. Well done us. Now, without messing about, that takes us directly to the third step in the argument, because the third step in the argument is just a tiny step on from 2. It says we shouldn't rely on the faster processes in unfamiliar situations. What we've seen here is that actually we can go a bit beyond that. So this is what it says. But actually we can go and say that we shouldn't rely on the faster processes if we have reason to think that the person doesn't have representative experience or hasn't had good feedback in the evolutionary, cultural or personal history that shaped those faster processes. Very good. So the next thing we need to do is move on with these great successes to step 4 of the argument.